Okay, let's just jump straight into a question that feels, well, pretty fundamental to being human. Can we ever truly, perfectly understand another person? You know, that feeling where you think you're completely on the same page, sharing the exact same thought or feeling. We kind of chase that feeling, don't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, we do. And often we operate under the assumption that it's not only possible, but maybe even the whole point of communication.
Right.
But what if, as this really fascinating philosophical investigation we've been looking at suggests, what if that perfect alignment is actually, well, an illusion?
An illusion. Wow, that's a strong claim.
It is.
So this source material we're diving into, it argues that every single conversation is fundamentally unique. Not because we're bad communicators, necessarily, but because it happens across different dimensional interpretations, as it calls them.
Exactly. These dimensions, they can never perfectly align.
And it says the gap in understanding, that space between us, it isn't a bug. It's not something broken that needs fixing.
No, it's positioned as a core feature of consciousness itself, almost intrinsic to how minds work.
Okay, so our mission, then, in this deep dive is to really unpack why this source makes such a, well, radical argument.
Right. We need to get into the surprising mathematical reasons it offers, and also the deep dive into the experience of consciousness, the phenomenology that it uses as sort of proof.
Proof for why complete, totally mutual understanding is inherently impossible.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the claim.
So let's start with that illusion of mutual understanding.
Yeah.
The source suggests our default setting, you know, how we usually operate, is to assume the person we're talking to shares our interpretive framework.
It calls that D1 compatibility, basically assuming we have this shared foundation of understanding.
And the source is saying that assumption is precisely where the illusion kicks in.
That's the core idea here, yeah. According to the source, most conversations don't actually happen in that perfectly aligned D1 space. They're really occurring across different dimensional realms of understanding.
Like D2 or maybe even further out. Exactly. Places where interpretations just naturally diverge. And the source, it lays out several core barriers that kind of make that D1 assumption faulty right from the get-go.
Okay, so what are those core barriers then? What stops us from reaching D1?
Well, the first is simply the assumption itself. Just assuming a shared framework that isn't necessarily there, that's a primary source of misalignment right away.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, the very fact that conversations inherently play out in these different interpretive dimensions means the starting points for understanding are already distinct for each person involved.
And it says something pretty profound about what would actually be needed for perfect understanding, doesn't it? Something almost impossible.
It really does. The source argues that to truly, perfectly understand another person's interpretation of, well, anything, you need access to their entire personal history.
Their whole life experience.
Yeah, the unique sequence of experiences, thoughts, feelings, everything that built their specific interpretive lens. And, well, obviously you can't access that directly.
Because we can't actually step inside their subjective consciousness. We're sort of bounded by our own first-person perspective, right?
Precisely. That inability to access another's subjective consciousness, their unique what it's like to be them, that creates a permanent, irreducible barrier. It's just how consciousness works, according to this view.
And it's fascinating because the source even brings in mathematics to back this up. You mentioned a proof.
Yeah, it mentions there's a proof showing that identical conversations, like word for word, tone for tone, identical, even simple ones, cannot strictly recur over time.
Wait, a mathematical proof for something that sounds so philosophical. Okay, now I'm really curious. Tell us about this model. How does math get involved in proving the impossibility of perfect understanding?
Okay, so the source introduces what it calls the temporal combinatorial model, or TCM for short. It uses this formula, PT-E-T-T.
Right.
And that formula quantifies the probability of PT of a conversation repeating exactly after a certain amount of time has passed, which is...
Okay, break that down for us. PT is the probability. What are the other bits? Omega, A, and K.
Right. So A represents the conversational complexity. Think of it as the total number of possible ways a conversation could go. All the potential states or paths.
Wow.
It's calculated as K to the power of N, so Kn.
Okay.
K is the number of possible elements available at each step. That's not just words, but tone, gestures, facial expressions, even the surrounding context.
Everything.
Everything. And N is the number of elements or turns in the conversation. Now, even for a really short exchange, K and N get large very quickly, which makes A, well, it's a truly colossal number,
Okay.
astronomical.
So A captures the sheer, almost mind-boggling complexity of all the ways a conversation could possibly unfold. Just the raw possibilities.
Oh, exactly. And then K is the temporal decay rate. This part captures how quickly everything relevant to that conversation changes over time.
Changes. How so?
It's the sum of two things. Lambda, which is the environmental change rate, how the external world, the context, shifts around the conversation, and gamma, the cognitive decay rate.
Cognitive decay.
Yeah, how your own understanding, your memory, your internal state, how all that changes moment by moment, day by day.
Okay, so the formula is basically saying the chance of hitting the exact same conversation again depends on how incredibly complex it is, that huge A number, and how quickly everything changes, both around you and inside you, that rate K.
You got it. That's precisely the idea. And the numbers the source presents to illustrate this are, well, they're almost cosmic in scale.
Like what? Give us an example.
Okay, so for a relatively simple conversation, let's say just 100 words long, the probability of repeating it exactly the same way at time zero, p0, essentially the probability of it happening just once in that specific way, is already incredibly tiny, something like 10 to the minus 100.
10 to the minus 100, that's basically zero.
Effectively zero, yeah. But the really stunning part is how quickly that probability drops even further because of the decay, the K factor. After just 7 days, according to the model, that probability plummets even more dramatically.
How much more?
To roughly 10 to the minus 131.
Wow. Okay, so after just 1 week, the chance of having that identical 100-word exchange again isn't just tiny, it's statistically indistinguishable from impossible. It just won't happen.
Right. It quickly becomes cosmically, utterly impossible. Time isn't neutral here. It constantly erodes the possibility of exact repetition, both in the conversation itself and, crucially, in our interpretation of past conversations.
So every conversation is a unique, fleeting event. And our understanding of it and of the other person is constantly being reshaped by this ongoing temporal decay.
That's the mathematical argument in a nutshell. Every moment is unique, every interaction unrepeatable.
Okay, that's the math side.
Yeah.
But the source also dives deep into the experience of consciousness itself, the phenomenological side, right? What does just being a conscious subject mean for how we understand others?
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how our own fundamental subjective experience inherently creates these barriers to understanding. The source highlights several key features of consciousness from this perspective. First, intentionality.
Intentionality.
Yeah, the idea that consciousness isn't just a blank slate. It's always directed towards something, objects, ideas, people, you name it. But crucially, how it's directed, the focus, is shaped by your unique history and experience.
So it creates a personal lens.
Exactly, a personal lens through which you interpret everything, including language. Which leads to the next point, lived experience.
So my lived experience isn't just, like, background noise. It's the actual filter.
It is the filter. Each person's specific background, their unique stream of consciousness, their history, it all irreducibly influences how they understand words, concepts, situations, and in ways that you can't perfectly replicate or transmit to someone else.
Which leads directly to the core of the intersubjectivity problem, I guess.
That's right, which is essentially the idea that we're fundamentally isolated within our own minds.
Kind of trapped in our own experiential bubble, as the source puts it.
That's the phrase, yeah. We can try to understand you, through observation, communication, empathy. But we can never directly access or experience your raw consciousness, your thoughts, your feelings as you experience them.
That feels like a permanent barrier, then.
It is. According to this view, it's a permanent barrier to perfect mutual understanding.
And what about this idea they mentioned, the hermeneutic circle? That sounds complex.
It sounds complex, but the basic idea is fairly intuitive. It's the concept that all interpretation is circular. You understand new information by relating it to what you already know, your existing knowledge, beliefs, biases, your pre-understanding.
Yep.
This creates a loop. Your current understanding shapes how you interpret new things, but interpreting those new things then subtly modifies your understanding, which then affects future interpretations. It's a circle.
And since everyone's pre-understanding, their starting point in that circle is unique.
Their interpretation within that circle will always be unique, too. It can't be otherwise.
And our understanding isn't fixed either, right? It evolves over time.
Precisely. That's the temporal structure aspect. Your past experiences, your memories, how you process them, they constantly modify your present understanding of everything. What a word or concept meant to you yesterday might shift, even just subtly, today because of something new you learned or felt.
So there's this constant interpretive drift within our own minds.
Let alone between minds. Exactly.
Let's say.
So these deep phenomenological aspects, intentionality, lived experience, intersubjectivity, the hermeneutic circle, temporal structure, combined with the mathematical unlikelihood of exact repetition, well, that forms the source's powerful case.
The case that perfect understanding isn't just hard, it's philosophically impossible.
That's the argument.
Wow. Okay, to help us visualize these gaps in understanding, this source introduces a concept, levels of conversational understanding, a dimensional hierarchy of interpretations.
Yeah, it's a really useful framework, I think, for seeing where miscommunication actually comes from. The core insight is pretty straightforward. Often the speaker assumes they're communicating in D1.
D1 being the dimension of most compatible shared understanding, the ideal.
Right, the ideal, the assumed common ground, but the listener is often actually interpreting in D2.
And D2 is?
D2 is the dimension of possible interpretations, or maybe even further out.
So how does the source lay out these different dimensions? What are they?
Okay, so D1 is described as this infinite space of all possible interpretations of any given communication, like the theoretical total universe of meaning.
Everything imaginable.
Pretty much. Then D1 is that dimension of most compatible interpretation, the assumed common ground, what we often wish communication was.
But reality, you're saying, usually lives in D2.
Exactly. D2 is the dimension of possible interpretations. This is where you realize, okay, there isn't just one way to hear that. There are multiple plausible ways based on different assumptions or contexts. This is where most communication actually happens, according to the source.
And beyond D2?
Then you get into D3, which is for unlikely interpretations. Maybe someone's deliberately misunderstanding or trolling, you know.
Okay.
D4 is for unique interpretations, things that might seem bordering on absurdism, often quickly flagged and corrected in conversation.
And it goes even further. D5.
Yeah, D5 and beyond, D5 plus, are described as the unfound dimensions interpretations that just haven't been considered or explored yet. And finally, there's D, which represents impossible dimensions interpretations that are just logically contradictory within whatever system you're using.
That's quite a hierarchy.
It is. But the crucial point it makes is that effective communication probably involves acknowledging that the actual landing zone is usually D2 or beyond. Miscommunication often stems from stubbornly assuming D1 when that's just not where the interpretation is happening.
This entire framework really seems to reinforce the idea that perfect translation between minds is impossible, unless the two minds were somehow perfectly identical. The source calls this the personal experience barrier, right?
It's the logical endpoint, isn't it? It flows naturally from everything else. If your interpretation is built on your unique history, your unique body, your unique consciousness, and you can't transfer that entire package to someone else,
then perfect translation of meaning is fundamentally blocked.
Exactly. And the source makes the clever point that even if you could transfer it, if you became perfectly identical to the other person, well, then the need for communication would just vanish, wouldn't it?
Right. So the very act of needing to communicate implies the difference that makes perfect understanding impossible in the first place. That's kind of mind-bending.
It is a bit, yeah.
So what are the key facets of this personal experience barrier that the source really highlights?
Well, there are several key ones. First, unique conceptual frameworks. Your whole system for organizing and interpreting information is just singular, shaped by your life. No two are exactly alike.
Okay.
Then, personal language associations. Words aren't just dictionary definitions, are they? They carry private meanings, emotions, memories for you that are totally inaccessible to me.
That makes total sense. Like, the word home evokes specific feelings and images for you based on your home, which are different from mine, even if we agree on the basic definition.
Precisely. And then there's temporal evolution, which we touched on. Your own understanding of a word or concept shifts over time as you have new experiences. The you of today interprets things differently than the you of yesterday.
And culture plays a role, too.
Hugely. Cultural and social contexts. The meanings embedded within specific groups or societies are incredibly difficult to fully transmit or understand outside of that shared context.
And it's not just the mind, is it? The body's involved, too.
Absolutely. Embodied knowledge. Physical experiences shape meaning in ways that language often just can't fully capture. How do you perfectly translate the specific feeling of, say, cold wind on your face after being cooped up indoors all day?
Or the muscle memory of riding a bike. You can describe it, but...
But you can't transfer the feeling, the embodied knowing.
And circling back to the hermeneutic circularity and the consciousness barrier?
They're integral parts of this personal barrier, absolutely. Your pre-understanding always filters incoming information, creating unique interpretations. And the simple, stark fact that we can't directly access your subjective experience means we can never verify if our understanding matches yours perfectly. It's sealed off.
It's locked in there.
Right. And the source includes a quote that really encapsulates this beautifully, I think. It says, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. But the limits of your language mean the limits of our shared world."
So the overlap, that shared world, is limited by the edges of each individual's unique, untranslatable language and experience.
That's the idea. The shared space is inherently constrained.
Okay, to make this more concrete, less abstract, the source uses a framework to analyze some common statements, showing how different interpretations can arise across these dimensions.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful demonstration, I found. It explicitly shows the dual perspectives possible for just a single statement, how the same words can plausibly land in two very different D2 interpretations, depending entirely on the listener's framework.
And it reveals the hidden assumptions too, right? The
Yeah.
stuff we don't say, but that shapes how we hear things.
Exactly. The underlying worldviews, the biases that aren't spoken but fundamentally shape how something is received. And through this, it highlights meaning, divergence, how the intended meaning can fundamentally differ from the received meaning.
And ultimately, the persistent understanding gaps that inherent space between people that can't ever be fully closed.
Right. It's always there.
Okay, let's walk through a few of those case studies it uses. First one, I believe everything happens for a reason. Pretty common phrase.
Very common. And the source contrasts, for example, a theistic interpretation where events are seen through the lens of divine providence, spiritual purpose, maybe faith, a moral order.
Right, God's plan sort of thing.
Yeah. Contrasted with a naturalistic interpretation, which might view such beliefs as, say, cognitive biases, seeking patterns where there are none, or post hoc rationalization, or maybe just deterministic causation without any inherent purpose, or even just a psychological comfort mechanism.
Wow, okay. Same sentence, completely different interpretive dimensions at play. Worlds apart, really.
Absolutely. Or how about money can't buy happiness? Another classic.
Yep, hear that all the time.
So a materialist perspective might interpret this by focusing on how actually financial security enables happiness by removing major stressors, right? How poverty obviously causes suffering, how wealth provides opportunities, the importance of meeting basic needs first.
Sort of pushing back against the statement, in a way.
In a way, yes. Whereas an experientialist view might counter by pointing to things like hedonic adaptation, the fact that we quickly get used to material things and they stop bringing joy.
Right, the new car thrill wears off.
Exactly. And this view would emphasize the greater importance of relationships, experiences, maybe the potential for wealth to actually complicate life, and focus more on intrinsic motivation rather than external rewards.
Again, two entirely different ways of processing that simple phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's one that feels particularly resonant right now. We need to follow the science.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. So a scientific interpretation here would likely emphasize empirical data as the ultimate objective truth. Trusting the experts, letting them guide policy based on rational analysis, seeing the scientific method as the gold standard for decisions.
Kind of science is the final authority.
Pretty much. But a humanistic perspective, on the other hand, would argue that science always operates within social contexts, that values and ethics matter just as much as data, that lived experience holds valid knowledge too.
That it's not the only way of knowing.
Exactly. And that maybe multiple ways of knowing truth exist, suggesting perhaps a more democratic approach to knowledge creation and policy decisions, rather than just deferring to experts. The same call to action, follow the science, can mean radically different things depending on your underlying view of science itself.
Okay, and a classic conversational stopper. That's just your opinion.
Ah, yes. So a relativist interpretation might hear that and think, well, yes, truth is contextual and subjective. It might embrace multiple valid perspectives, dismiss claims of absolute truth, value personal and cultural frameworks, maybe promote tolerance for different views.
Kind of agreeing with the implication.
Whereas an objectivist interpretation would likely push back. It would argue that, no, some truths do exist independently of opinion, that pure relativism can lead to intellectual or even moral chaos.
That we need some standards.
Right. That standards are necessary for meaningful communication, and that there is such thing as a shared reality grounded in logic and evidence that we need as a basis for connection and progress.
Fascinating how much is loaded into that simple phrase. Okay, finally, a really simple one that can mean so much. I'm fine.
Oh, the classic I'm fine. So a surface interpretation just takes this literally. Okay, they said they're fine, respects boundaries, avoids prying, adheres to the social norms of polite distance.
Accepts it at face value.
Right, but a depth interpretation, well, that recognizes fine, can often mask underlying distress. It might see it as potentially an implicit invitation to gently probe further, maybe paying close attention to nonverbal cues, considering the relational context.
Is this person someone who usually says they're fine when they're not?
Exactly. The same two syllables, I'm fine, can exist in vastly different interpretive dimensions, leading to completely different responses and interactions.
Those examples really, really drive home how much is packed into everyday language and how easily, almost inevitably, interpretations can diverge. So summing up then, according to this source, why does perfect understanding remain perpetually elusive? Why can't we just get there?
Well, it really boils down to the combination of all those fundamental barriers we've been discussing. They all converge on that core point.
Right.
Perfect translation of meaning would require perfect identity between minds, which is impossible. It's the unique conceptual frameworks we each build, the deeply personal associations we have with language, the constant temporal evolution of our own understanding, the embedded cultural and social contexts we inhabit.
Our embodied experience.
Our embodied experiences, exactly. The circular nature of the hermeneutic process, how we always interpret through our existing lens, and underlying it all, that irreducible barrier of subjective consciousness. You just can't be me and I can't be you.
So these factors, individually and together, they just ensure that your internal world of meaning is forever distinct from mine.
That's the conclusion the source reaches. Forever distinct.
Okay, if perfect understanding isn't possible, what does that mean for things like, well, morality?
Yeah.
Or justice? Or how we even govern ourselves? The source gets into the moral consequences of conversational uniqueness.
Yeah, this section argues that our ethical frameworks, our ideas about moral obligation, they have to take these fundamental interpretive limits into account. We can't just pretend they don't exist. But importantly, it doesn't mean abandoning standards for how we treat each other.
So how do we balance that?
Well, it suggests this reality should foster what it calls epistemic humility. Basically, a recognition of the inherent limitations in our ability to fully grasp another person's perspective, their motivations, their internal world, knowing that we don't, and maybe can't, have the full picture.
And that humility should probably encourage charitable interpretation, right? Assuming good faith when miscommunication inevitably happens, instead of immediately jumping to negative conclusions about the other person's intent.
Yes, exactly. Assume good faith first. But it also raises some really complex questions about moral responsibility. If perfect understanding was never realistically possible, how much can someone truly be held accountable for the negative outcomes of a miscommunication? Where does responsibility lie?
That's tricky, and it must have huge implications for justice systems.
Huge. Legal interpretation of evidence, testimony, intent. It all has to grapple with these dimensional differences. How do you judge intent when understanding is always partial?
And for democratic discourse, too. Public debates, policy discussions.
Absolutely. Public deliberation often assumes we share certain foundational understandings or goals, but this source suggests those shared foundations might not actually exist across the deep interpretive divides in society. That makes genuine consensus building incredibly challenging, maybe even impossible in some cases.
It's fascinating how this contemporary philosophical work, with its math models and all, seems to echo ideas from much older traditions, doesn't it? The source touches on classical philosophy meets modern mathematics.
It really does. Philosophers have wrestled with aspects of the mind, understanding, and communication for centuries. Cartesian dualism highlighted that mind-body separation, making other minds seem inherently inaccessible.
Right.
Behaviorism tried to just bypass internal states altogether and focus only on observable actions. Phenomenology, as we discussed, really zeroed in on that irreducible subjective experience. And analytic philosophy grappled with the logic of language and thought, often bumping up against similar interpretive problems.
But this temporal combinatorial model, the TCM, it adds something new to this long history, doesn't it? It's not just intuition anymore.
It really does add something concrete. It provides a formal mathematical grounding for some of these long-standing philosophical intuitions. It demonstrates mathematically that interpretive uniqueness isn't just an abstract idea. It's a demonstrable reality, statistically speaking.
So it shows that perfect knowledge of other minds isn't just difficult or unlikely.
It's statistically impossible given the complexity and the constant decay. And crucially, that temporal component, the K factor, shows that even approximate understanding is fundamentally unstable. It's always shifting, always degrading over time.
Which has clear relevance for fields today, like AI and consciousness studies.
Absolutely. It poses some deep challenges for those fields.
Let's circle back to that idea of time for a moment, because the source really emphasizes how time destroys conversational repeatability. It paints a vivid picture.
It's such a striking concept, isn't it? And we saw the numbers earlier, how the probability of an exact conversation repeating just collapses exponentially. From that tiny 10/100 at time 0.
Down to 10/131 in just a week. It's mind-bogglingly fast.
It is, and the decay mechanisms are what drive that rapid collapse.
Yeah. What are they again?
Well, there's immediate change. Just having the conversation instantly alters both participants and the context for the very next moment. Then you have environmental factors, everything from news headlines, the weather, a random encounter you have, all subtly shifting your interpretive context outside the conversation itself.
And cognitive factors happening inside us.
Right. Your own memories consolidating overnight, new things you learn, emotions you experience. They constantly modify your internal framework for interpreting past events and language.
It's like our minds are constantly re-rendering past conversations through the lens of the ever-changing present. We can't step in the same conversational river twice.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the source also mentions feedback loops. Every act of interpretation and communication changes the system itself, feeding back into future interpretations. It's dynamic.
So that exponential function, PKKT, it just perfectly captures how all this continuous, multifaceted change leads to the rapid, near-cosmic impossibility of repeating an exact conversational moment.
Exactly. Time ensures uniqueness.
This idea of temporal evolution and lived experience seems so intimately linked to our physical selves, too. The source makes a really strong argument for how physical experience shapes understanding.
It fundamentally challenges any lingering idea that the mind is somehow separate from the body when it comes to making meaning. The source argues the body isn't just a container, it's the primary filter, the foundation for how we understand the world and language.
Like the concept of embodied cognition, the idea that even abstract concepts are somehow grounded in physical experiences.
Yes, exactly that. And think about basic sensory differences, variations in vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell. They create fundamentally unbridgeable gaps in how we perceive and therefore understand the world. My experience of the color red or the taste of coffee is physically different from yours at a neurological level.
We could agree on the label red, but the internal experience
Is private. And motor experience, how we move our bodies, interact with physical space that influences the very metaphors and concepts we use to think and talk. Think about metaphors like grasping an idea or moving forward.
They're rooted in physical actions. And emotional embodiment, too, right? Emotions aren't just mental states. They're felt in the body, and they deeply color our interpretation of events and words.
Absolutely. Fear, joy, anger, they have distinct physical signatures that shape our understanding. And then there are cultural bodies, societal norms and practices related to the body, like gesture, personal space, posture, eye contact. These create distinct interpretive frameworks across cultures.
How you stand, how close you get, it all means something different.
Right. Developmental embodiment, too. The sequence of physical development in infancy and childhood creates permanent differences in how we perceive and interact with the world later on. And finally, neuroplasticity, the fact that the brain's physical structure is constantly changing based on our unique experiences, means we each develop distinct cognitive architectures for making meaning.
So our physical selves are fundamental, non-translatable aspects of our interpretive frameworks. You can't separate the mind from the body in understanding.
That's the argument. They're completely intertwined.
Okay, bringing the mind, body, and social context together, it seems like language itself presents a huge paradox here. The Force calls it the paradox of linguistic communication. Language is our main tool for bridging the gap between minds, but this source is saying it's also a barrier. How can it be both?
That's the core paradox the source identifies, yeah. Language is undeniably a bridge, right? It enables us to share internal states, at least approximately. It creates shared symbolic systems we can use. It allows for incredibly complex coordination and cooperation.
Building knowledge, reasoning together.
Exactly. Building vast bodies of cultural knowledge, facilitating abstract reasoning. It's fundamentally how we even attempt to reach across that void between our subjective universes. Without it, we'd be truly isolated.
Okay, so that's the bridge part, but then how is it also a barrier?
Because all those factors we've just discussed, personal history, embodiment, context, time they filter and shape language relentlessly, those personal associations attached to words, they remain private. The context and history that give words their full meaning are deeply embedded and incredibly hard to fully transmit.
And meanings change over time.
Yes, semantic drift means the meaning of words subtly changes for individuals and communities over time. The metaphorical structures we rely on differ based on our unique embodied experiences. And even when we're speaking the exact same language, the act of translating meaning from my internal conceptual system to yours is always approximate. It's never perfect 1.1 mapping.
So the paradox is, language is the only real tool we have to communicate across the gap, but the very nature of that tool, filtered through our unique selves, ensures that what arrives on the other side is always a transformed, incomplete version of what was sent.
That's it, exactly. Perfect translation of meaning between individuals using language is structurally impossible, according to this view. Language enables connection, absolutely, but the connection is always mediated, always transformed by the unique interpretive systems of the speakers involved. It's both connection and separation, simultaneously.
Wow. And those interpretive systems aren't just individual, are they? They're also shaped by the larger groups we belong to. The source talks about how societies shape interpretive frameworks.
Right. Cultures and societies provide these large-scale collective frameworks that can create fundamentally incompatible starting points for understanding the world and each other. Think about the really deep differences between, say, primarily collectivist versus primarily individualist societies.
They have completely different assumptions about the self, group responsibility, how relationships should function.
Totally different operating systems in a way. Or consider high context versus low context communication styles.
Where one relies on unspoken understanding and the other on explicit words.
Exactly. Societies that rely heavily on implicit understanding and shared background knowledge interpret communication signals very differently from those that prioritize explicit verbal statements. Misunderstandings there are almost guaranteed if you're not aware of the difference.
And things like power distance.
Yeah, how a culture understands and expresses authority, disagreement, hierarchy that deeply shapes communication patterns. Temporal orientation, too, whether a society tends to emphasize the past, present, or future, creates different priorities and ways of interpreting events, plans, even time itself. These broad societal lenses act as powerful, often invisible, ingrained filters on how we process and understand every single communication.
And it's not just society. Even within our own minds, our inherent ways of thinking can distort understanding, can't they? The source talks about how mental shortcuts distort understanding.
Yeah, and this is crucial. The source points out that cognitive biases aren't necessarily flaws or bugs to be eliminated. They're often fundamental features of how the human brain processes information efficiently in a complex world, but that efficiency comes at a cost.
The cost being objective accuracy and therefore perfect understanding.
Exactly. These shortcuts make perfect, unbiased understanding structurally impossible.
Like confirmation bias, we're just wired to notice and interpret things in a way that confirms what we already believe, aren't we?
We are. It's a powerful default. And the fundamental attribution error, our tendency to explain other people's behavior based on their personality, they're lazy, rather than considering the situation they might be in. Maybe they're having a really tough day.
Right. But we explain our own behavior situationally.
Often, yes. Then there's the availability heuristic, judging how likely or important something is based purely on how easily examples spring to mind. Or anchoring bias, relying way too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if it's irrelevant.
And projection, unconsciously assuming others think or feel the same way we do.
Yeah, attributing our own stuff onto them. In-group bias is another big one, interpreting the exact same statement or action completely differently, depending on whether it comes from someone we perceive as being part of our group versus their group.
Us versus them thinking.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
And the halo effect, letting a general positive or negative impression of someone totally color how we interpret everything else they do or say. These shortcuts, while maybe cognitively useful for quick decisions, systematically bend our interpretations away from any kind of perfect objectivity or mutual understanding. They're built-in distortion fields.
And the brain itself, the actual physical hardware, seems built for approximation when it comes to understanding others, not precision. The source looks at brain mechanisms behind interpretive differences.
Yeah, it dives into the potential neural basis for these interpretive differences, suggesting the brain is essentially wired for efficient approximation, for good enough understanding, rather than perfect, detailed mind reading, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, maybe.
So things like mirror neurons.
Right. While they seem to enable us to simulate others' actions and perhaps intentions, the source suggests they do so imperfectly and with significant individual variability. It's not a perfect mirroring. And theory of mind networks, the brain areas involved in actively trying to figure out others' mental states, beliefs, desires,
Was also vary between people.
they show significant individual differences in how they function and how accurate they are. Then there's the default mode network, which is often active when we're thinking about ourselves or others. It tends to filter external information through our own self-referential processing, our own concerns and history.
Making it about us, in a way.
Often, yeah. And emotional processing centers like the amygdala and the broader limbic system automatically color our interpretation of situations and intentions in ways we aren't always consciously aware of. Fear, trust, attraction, these biases kick in fast.
And that's before you even get to individual brain differences.
Exactly. Add to that the vast individual differences in brain structure and function, plus the constant reshaping due to neuroplasticity based on unique life experiences. You see how each brain literally develops a unique architecture for processing and interpreting information.
Even attention networks play a role, what we focus on.
Absolutely. What one person focuses on and deems relevant in a conversation or situation can be completely different from what another person picks up on. We filter constantly. All these neural factors contribute to the inherent, unavoidable divergence in interpretation at the most fundamental level.
This whole picture, the math, the consciousness, the brain, it has pretty profound implications for artificial intelligence, doesn't it? What conversational uniqueness means for AI.
Oh, absolutely profound. It basically suggests that achieving true human-level understanding, particularly the kind that grasps nuanced, context-dependent, subjective meaning, might actually be philosophically impossible for AI, at least as we currently conceive of it.
Why? Because they lack lived experience.
That's a huge part of it. AI systems lack true experiential grounding. Their knowledge comes from digesting vast amounts of training data, which is fundamentally different from having a first-person, embodied, lived experience in the world.
And they don't really model that temporal decay we talked about, do they? They operate within fixed context windows or data sets. They don't have that constant internal evolution of understanding.
Exactly. They lack that personal history and the ongoing decay-evolution dynamic. There's also the embodiment problem. AI lacks a physical body interacting with the world, which, as we've discussed, this source argues is fundamental to how humans make meaning.
They can't grasp an idea, literally.
Right. They also inherently struggle with cultural sensitivity, which relies on navigating these incredibly subtle, dimensionally distinct frameworks that humans absorb implicitly. And at the very deepest level, AI runs headfirst into the hard problem of consciousness itself, that fundamental mystery of subjective experience of what it's like, which seems prerequisite for truly human-like understanding.
So what does that mean for future AI?
Well, the source implies that maybe future AI shouldn't even aim for a singular, correct understanding of human input. Perhaps more advanced AI would need to explicitly model multiple possible interpretation dimensions, like D1, D2, D3, and learn to represent uncertainty about meaning rather than outputting a single, confident interpretation.
Acknowledging the ambiguity inherent in human language.
Precisely. Recognizing the gap.
Okay, shifting from AI back to human interaction, what does this understanding of interpretive uniqueness mean for something like teaching? Teaching in light of conversational uniqueness. How should educators approach this?
It really calls for a pretty fundamental shift in educational philosophy, doesn't it? Less emphasis on just transmitting fixed, supposedly objective knowledge from teacher to student.
Like pouring water into an empty glass.
Exactly, and more emphasis on developing students' capabilities to interpret information from multiple perspectives, to understand the limits of their own understanding, and to navigate these different interpretive realms effectively.
So acknowledging that students walk into the classroom with vastly different prior knowledge, cultural filters, lived experiences respecting those. Multiple perspectives from the start.
Yes, and it means teaching requires actively scaffolding. Understanding consciously building bridges between a student's existing framework and new concepts, rather than just assuming a blank slate or a shared starting point that probably isn't there.
That must present huge assessment challenges, though. How do you grade understanding when interpretations can validly differ based on different starting points?
It's a massive challenge. It also demands real cultural responsiveness from educators, recognizing how students' diverse backgrounds shape their learning styles, their communication patterns, their interpretation of materials.
And maybe teaching students about these limits.
Absolutely. Fostering metacognitive awareness, teaching students to think about their own thinking, their own biases, their own interpretive processes, helping them understand how they understand and how others might understand differently.
In a similar vein, counseling and therapy must constantly grapple with these limits too, surely.
Constantly. And the source suggests something interesting here, that therapeutic healing doesn't necessarily rely on the therapist achieving perfect, objective understanding of the client's experience, because that's impossible anyway.
So what does it rely on?
Perhaps more on the quality of the connection, the empathy, the care offered despite that inherent limit. It calls for therapeutic humility, the therapist acknowledging the inherent boundaries, that they can't fully enter the client's subjective world.
Recognizing empathic limits, you can empathize deeply, but you can't perfectly replicate another's pain or joy.
Exactly. And different therapeutic schools often operate within different interpretive frameworks themselves, adding another layer of dimensional difference.
And cultural competence becomes absolutely critical, doesn't it? To even begin to bridge those potential dimensional divides between a client's world and the therapist's framework.
Utterly vital. And experiences like trauma often actively resist easy linguistic capture or neat interpretation, highlighting the limits of language itself within the therapeutic space.
So what's the mechanism for healing then, if not perfect understanding?
The source suggests the therapeutic alliance, the quality of the relationship between client and therapist, becomes a primary mechanism for healing. It's perhaps more important than achieving perfect intellectual comprehension of the problem. It's about collaborative meaning-making.
Working together.
Yeah, working together to explore the client's experience and perhaps construct new interpretations or narratives that are helpful and empowering for the client, rather than the therapist acting like an expert uncovering a single hidden correct truth about the client's past or psyche.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's shift to justice systems. These rely so heavily on testimony, interpreting actions, figuring out intent. This must present constant, thorny challenges. Justice systems and conversational evidence.
Oh, absolutely. Legal systems are fundamentally built on interpreting human communication, behavior, and intention, and the source argues they have to grapple with the fact that these are inherently interpretive acts, filtered through all the barriers we've discussed.
Take witness testimony, for example. It's not like a video recording, is it?
Not at all. It's a subjective interpretation filtered through memory, perception, bias, stress, language. It's inherently constructive, not reproductive. And cross-cultural justice faces systemic challenges when legal frameworks, assumptions about truth-telling, and communication styles clash across dimensional lines.
And the whole difficulty of discerning intent versus impact becomes incredibly clear when a single action or statement can be reasonably interpreted in vastly different ways by different people.
Exactly. How do you prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt when the meaning itself is potentially ambiguous across dimensions? Jury deliberation is another fascinating example. You have individuals from diverse backgrounds bringing their own unique interpretive frameworks to bear on the exact same set of evidence,
Trying to reach a shared interpretation.
which is incredibly difficult. Expert testimony also involves translating specialized knowledge across potentially huge dimensional gaps to a lay audience, judges, juries. Confession validity can be impacted by cultural factors, power dynamics, cognitive states, suggestibility, all affecting how questions are understood and answered.
And even the standard of proof itself, beyond a reasonable doubt, ultimately requires interpreting what constitutes reasonable and what the evidence means within different potential frameworks or narratives. It's interpretation all the way down.
Pretty much.
Looking at the bigger picture then, what does this pervasive interpretive pluralism mean for how we govern ourselves? Governance in the age of interpretive pluralism.
It suggests that maybe democratic governance in complex, diverse societies needs to shift its goal. Perhaps less focus on achieving perfect consensus, which might be impossible anyway.
And more focus on?
More focus on constructively managing the fundamental, unavoidable interpretive pluralism that exists, recognizing it's there and finding ways to work with it or around it.
So things like echo chambers aren't just about people hearing different facts.
No, the source suggests they represent a kind of dimensional segregation in public discourse. People aren't just consuming different information, they're operating within fundamentally different interpretive frameworks that make bridging the gap incredibly hard. Public deliberation, while valuable, often assumes shared understandings and goals that might just not exist across these divides.
And media interpretation obviously exacerbates this, presenting the same events through wildly different, often conflicting interpretive lenses.
Absolutely. Policy communication becomes incredibly challenging, too. How do you explain complex issues and government interventions effectively across the vast dimensional gaps that often exist between policymakers, technical experts, and the general public?
It raises fundamental questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, is true consensus building ever really possible across fundamentally different ways of seeing the world? How can elected officials genuinely represent constituents whose lived experiences and interpretive frameworks they can't fully access or understand?
Right. And ultimately, what constitutes democratic legitimacy when citizens interpret the actions, motivations, and goals of their own government in such fundamentally divergent ways? It's a deep challenge for governance today.
Wow. Okay, let's go even deeper, maybe more personal, even spiritual.
Yeah.
What are the implications of this conversational uniqueness for meaning itself? The source explores meaning-making across interpretive realms.
Yeah, it goes to a pretty existential place here. It suggests that perhaps the deepest forms of human connection and meaning don't actually come from dissolving the boundaries of the self through achieving perfect understanding, because that's impossible.
So where do they come from?
Maybe they come from a shared acknowledgement and navigation of our mutual inaccessibility, finding connection in the shared struggle to understand rather than in the arrival at perfect understanding. It raises profound questions about ultimate questions, things about the meaning of life, purpose. Do these questions even retain shared ground across vastly different interpretive dimensions?
And experiences like death and mortality. They seem to fundamentally resist ordinary linguistic or conceptual communication, don't they? Creating profound interpretive isolation around grief and loss.
They really do. And transcendence, mystical or spiritual experiences, by their very definition, they seem to exceed ordinary categories in language, making them incredibly difficult to share or interpret commonly.
So it explores that constant interplay between community and isolation, how we strive for connection knowing we are, in a fundamental sense, alone in our own interpretive universes.
Exactly that tension. It also looks at how sacred versus secular frameworks create deeply incompatible interpretive systems that shape literally everything from daily life choices to existential questions about reality.
And perhaps ultimately it leaves us with a sense of cosmic loneliness, the beautiful, but maybe also unsettling reality that each conscious mind exists within its own unique, untranslatable interpretive realm.
It's a powerful, maybe sobering thought, but maybe also liberating in a way.
That's a heavy, but perhaps ultimately accepting thought. The source doesn't just leave us there in existential angst, though, does it? It offers some practical wisdom for working within the limits of understanding.
No, it definitely pivots back to practical strategies. It's about how to navigate this inherent gap, not by wishing it away or pretending it doesn't exist, but by understanding it better and managing it more skillfully.
So, reiterating that call for epistemic humility, knowing what you don't know about another's perspective.
Absolutely. Starting there and practicing active listening, really truly focusing on understanding the other person's framework as best as you possibly can, rather than just formulating your own reply while they're still talking.
And perspective taking, actively making the effort to step into their shoes, intellectually and emotionally, even while recognizing it's always going to be an approximation, never perfect.
Right. It's the effort that counts. Also, clarification. Seeking explicitly asking questions to check your interpretation against theirs. So, if I understand you correctly, you're saying, could you tell me more about why you see it that way?
Simple, but powerful.
And patience and charity, assuming positive intent, allowing for missteps and misunderstandings, given how inherently difficult communication is, cutting people some slack. And finally, meta-communication.
Talking about the talking.
Exactly. Talking about how you were communicating and interpreting, addressing the process itself when things get stuck. I feel like we might be misunderstanding each other here. Can we back up?
So the overall goal isn't to magically eliminate misunderstanding altogether, because that's impossible.
Right.
But maybe to reduce its frequency, mitigate its negative impacts, and understand its nature more clearly when it inevitably occurs.
That seems to be the realistic, achievable goal. Which leads nicely into the final area the source touches on, advancing our understanding of misunderstanding. It basically suggests this is a really fertile ground for future research.
Like what kind of research?
Well, things like more empirical testing of these dimensional concepts in real conversations. Longitudinal studies tracking how individuals' interpretive frameworks shift over time. More cross-cultural research to map different societal frameworks. Neuroscientific investigation into the brain basis of interpretation and empathy.
Computational modeling to simulate these dynamics.
Yeah, maybe using AI to model miscommunication. And developing practical therapeutic and educational interventions that are specifically designed to account for these dimensional differences in human understanding and communication. There's a lot more to explore.
Okay, so to bring this all together then, living with conversational uniqueness. What's the final takeaway?
I think the core takeaway is really the acceptance. Accepting that complete, perfect mutual understanding is not just difficult, it's mathematically and philosophically impossible due to the inherent nature of consciousness, time, embodiment, language, and context.
So, embracing a kind of philosophical acceptance, seeing the mystery of other minds not as a defect or a problem to be solved, but as an essential, maybe even beautiful, part of the human condition.
Exactly. And considering the ethical implications that flow from that acceptance, how this reality should shape our moral behavior, promoting humility, charity, and maybe more realistic expectations for accountability and justice.
And putting into practice that practical wisdom we just discussed, using strategies like active listening and clarification to navigate the gap, striving for connection, care, and approximate understanding while always acknowledging the fundamental limits.
Right. The source suggests in a way that this very conversational uniqueness, this inability to perfectly merge, is precisely what makes us irreducibly individual. It maintains the integrity of the self.
While simultaneously fueling our perpetual human drive to seek connection and try to bridge that gap with others, however imperfectly.
It's that fundamental tension again. We are separate, yet we seek connection.
There's a really thought-provoking quote it concludes with, "Only the best works make it to the first dimension. Keep revising." What do you make of that?
I think it implies that achieving that ideal D1-like shared understanding, even if only temporarily or partially on a specific topic, isn't just a passive state we fall into. It's an active accomplishment.
It takes work.
It takes significant effort, constant adjustment, collaboration, and a real willingness to revise your own interpretations and communication strategies based on feedback. It's hard work to even get close to D1. Keep revising, keep working at it.
So, given everything we've explored today, the mathematical proof of conversational decay, the irreducible uniqueness of subjective experience, all those layers of interpretive dimensions, the way our bodies, brains, societies, and even language itself filter meaning. What does this fundamental reality, the idea that perfect understanding is truly impossible, mean for how you, listening right now, approach your own conversations?
Yeah, how might it change the way you listen or the way you speak?
Or maybe even how you judge others' actions or beliefs going forward, knowing the gap is always there. Definitely something to think about as you navigate your own unique interpretive universe.